Well, that's certainly the most beneficial way to interact with it. To just think of this whole thing as a game, and to think of this whole game as like this game will give you clues as to how to play it, and you'll have experiences that you can engage with, and you can say that you're enjoying them, or that you're getting pleasure out of that, or you're getting excitement out of that, or you're getting some sort of fulfillment out of that. But you still have to play the game. So you're here.
Right. And I think that's the key is, we all get different messages for when we're on the right path.
Yeah.
And when we're not. And I think we sometimes sense that, right? Sometimes things just kind of flow easily.
Yes.
And other times they don't necessarily. But yeah, I agree. I think, viewing the game in that way based on your own signals in your brain, in your body, that
your
is
intuition.
telling you your intuition, right?
Right.
And there's different ways to think about that. Like some people have suggested, like some physicists have suggested that there are these possible futures and that they are sending back information from the future to the present, right? Because time doesn't really exist the same way. When we get back into quantum mechanics, it starts to be weird. But so one of these guys talks about these futures are sending us information, and sometimes what we get are clues, right? Saying that, oh, this is a possibility. Maybe I should choose this over that. It's almost like the futures are sending back these messages to the past, and I think of that as different runs of the game, right? And so that that takes us even back to what I was talking about earlier with Philip K. Dick, right? And his idea that the universe, what happens is we actually go and we change variables and we rerun it, and we might have the sense that we're rerunning the same scene, we're saying the same things, but something could be different. And usually something is different when you run the simulation. And that's what got me into a whole nother rabbit hole, which I cover in my second book, which is the Mandela Effect. I don't know if you've heard about the Mandela Effect.
I have, but I don't necessarily totally understand it.
Yeah, well, I kind of dismissed the whole thing earlier, and the Mandela Effect is when a small group of people remember something happening differently in the past than what is the majority consensus opinion.
And it's about Mandela being dead, right?
Well, that was the first thing that kind of kicked off this blogger who actually coined the term. I think her name was Fiona Broom. It's just some people remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 80s. But of course, he didn't die in prison, right? You can look it up, right? He got out of prison, became president of South Africa, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and died in whatever it was, like more recently, like, I don't know, 2013 or something like that. But the people who remember this, they remember it with just like a whole bunch of specific details, right? His wife, Winnie, spoke at the funeral. There were certain U.S. politicians or presidents there. And so what happened was that was one Mandela effect, if you will. And then there started to be all these other things that people remembered that were different. And some of these were relatively minor things like the spelling of Fruit Loops or
Berenstain Bears.
That's the most famous one, right? The Berenstain Bears, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, in fact, here, we can see it there, right? If you ask people, most people remember it as the Berenstain Bears.
Right.
But when you look at it, it's actually the Berenstain Bears. Okay, it's a relatively small change, but it's one that people are really confused about. Then there's the movies, right? The movie lines, like in Star Wars, did he say, Luke, I am your father? Did Darth Vader actually say that, right? And then there were entire episodes of Star Trek where like the Trekkies in the audience remembered this episode, and they're talking to the cast members of the original Star Trek, and the cast members are like, we never shot this episode. What are you talking about? They're like, no, we saw it. This is what happened in the episode. And then you got like the whole Sinbad thing, which was a movie that he supposedly made called, was it Kazam or Shazam? It was all called Kazam, but there was actually a movie with Shaq called Shazam. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of these movie-related ones, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a bunch of these logo ones, like the Berenstain Bears. But the more interesting ones come, I think, with events like Mandela. Do you remember Tiananmen Square?
Mm-hmm.
what happened to that guy in front of the tank?
He stood in front of the tank and they removed him, right? They didn't run him over.
Right, that's what I remember too, right? But there's a group of people who remember, the tank running him over and said it was the bloodiest thing they ever saw on television, right? Like this vivid memory of this thing, right? Or like the Reverend Billy Graham, I don't know when he died, but, there are like these evangelical Christians who say that my parents follow this guy and they got a magazine with him on the cover saying he died many years earlier than he actually died, right? And they remember it vividly. And so those events start to become interesting. But the ones that I find really interesting are the ones where there's some interesting evidence, like scripture, right? So people take their scripture pretty seriously, right? Do you know the line in Isaiah about the lion and the lamb?
I don't remember it.
Yeah, but you remember there was a
Yes.
line, right, about a lion and a lamb. Well, it turns out there isn't, right? It has something, the wolf shall lie with the lamb or something like that, right? And what's weird is that people have like little wall clocks and things with a picture of a lion and a lamb.
But it's not even in the scripture.
It's not in the scripture, right? And so, and I thought, okay, well, maybe it's a translation thing, maybe one version of the King James Bible has it and the other one. And people are like, no, I have my same physical copy from when I was a kid, and I memorized this particular line, and so, and there are websites that track these different things that maybe have changed.
And what do you think these things are?
Well, so I started to wonder, does this happen in other scriptures? Is it only in like the Bible, like this is going on? And so I started looking around at Islam and the Quran, because they memorize the Quran word for word. I mean, that is like the first thing you have to do to become a priest, right? You have to like be able to say the whole damn thing. And I always wondered, why do you need to memorize it? It seems kind of stupid nowadays. You can just look it up. So I found this one Sufi imam online who was talking about this. And he says that in the Islamic traditions, in the Middle East, there are these beings that are allowed to go back in time and change things, physical things. But they're not allowed to change your memory, okay? And these beings are called the jinn. Right? We've heard of them from Aladdin, right? And the genie, right? Genie is singular for jinn, but that the jinn don't exist in space and time in the same way that we exist in space and time. And so the reason that they still memorize it word for word. Now, I don't know if this is something in the full orthodoxy, but this was his explanation, was that because the jinn are allowed to change physical objects, but they're not allowed to change our memory. That's why it's memorized word for word, so that nobody can mess, with the scripture. And so I found that really fascinating. But there are other physical objects, like the thinker. Okay, do you know the thinker?
The statue?
Yeah, the statue.
Yes.
Okay, so where is the guy's hand in that?
Isn't he doesn't his hand on his chin?
Yeah, it's kind of under his chin like this, right? I mean, we could even bring it up, right, if we can find it, right? But there's a ton of, there it is, right? And so there's several bronze casts of this. There was one at Stanford that I went and looked at recently. But what you find is there's a bunch of people with their hand at the top of their forehead, right? Standing next to the statue, right? And, okay, you might think there's a bunch of crazy tourists just doing it for fun, but it's really weird. So there's actually a picture that I found from the London unveiling of Rodin's The Thinker, which was George Bernard Shaw, G.B. Shaw, in the pose of the thinker. We'll see if we can find this picture, right? And so this was just the night before this was being rolled out to the public in London for the first time. I forget what year, like 1902 or something. Okay, so there's G.B. Shaw. This is like a famous picture now, right? In the pose of the thinker, and where is his hand?
On his head.
On his forehead. And he was probably standing right next to, where the statue was unveiled. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that all of this stuff happens. Like, I dismissed a lot of this as just faulty memory, and that's the currently accepted explanation for the Mandela Effect is, a bunch of people got it wrong, right? But what you find is that the more significance that something has to you, the less likely you are to get it wrong, right? So if you're Jewish and you asked your parents, why are these bears Jewish, right? And your parents didn't say, oh, it's not really Bernstein, it's Bernstein, right? That's proximity to that subject, right? There was a blogger online, I'm forgetting her name now. She was a journalism student in Chicago, and she said she went to South Africa to interview Nelson Mandela in prison and was told that he was too ill. So she literally came back, and then she started working for NPR. And then she says, well, I remember him dying shortly after. Now, if you just went to South Africa to interview Nelson Mandela and then you remember him dying, and that's proximity and significance. You're less likely to get it wrong than just some random guy who just thought Mandela died. Or if you're, heavy duty Christian and you're more likely to memorize certain passages, from the Bible.
Right.
So again, I dismissed it. And then what happened was, after I had written the simulation hypothesis about this idea that the whole world is computation, a friend of mine from MIT who was working at Google came to me and said, hey, have you heard the Mandela Effect? I was like, yeah, I heard about it, but, a bunch of people remembering, different stuff.
Right.
No big deal. He goes, well, the simulation hypothesis is one of the best explanations for this, that the world is a simulation. Now, I was surprised for two reasons. One, most guys, who work at who are at MIT or Google, they tend to be very left-brained, right? So the Mandela Effect is not something that they generally pay attention to, or UFOs, or any of this kind of weird stuff. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that if you're running a simulation and you go back and you change some variables and you rerun the simulation, lots of little things could be different along the way, right? And if you think of all the Mandela effects, imagine each of these as different possibilities. You got 50 of these effects or 100 of these effects. Now you basically have this huge graph, right? In this one, Darth Vader said this, but Curious George had a tail. In this one, he didn't. What you have is this network graph of possibilities of the past, right? You have many different possible pasts.
You have glitches in the matrix.
Exactly. So now you're sitting on this idea that maybe these are glitches in the matrix, that something weird has happened. But it could also be that we switched, right? You're now on this timeline, but you remember. You have a deja vu, or you have a weird memory. Right.
So even though you can Google, no, I was wrong about Mandela, in your mind and in your memory, you're like, no, he died in prison.
Right. Or, for me.
I know he died in prison. I remember it. I remember being sad. I remember the news stories.
Right.
I remember talking about it with friends.
Or Bill Clinton spoke at the funeral, or whoever, right?
Right.
People get that specific with their memories. And so I think it becomes harder to just dismiss some of these, Fruit Loops you can probably find.
There's some faulty memory.
Yeah, there's some faulty memory going on here, but at the same time,
some weirdness.
It's not, because it's not just a movie line, it's entire movies, right, that people claim to have had on VHS. Let's look at the one that was the Sinbad one, I think, right? So supposedly there was this movie by Sinbad.
Sinbad the comedian.
Yeah, the comedian, right, in the 90s, that people remember having, with their VHS tapes. And they were sitting there and they were rewinding it and they were talking about specific scenes from it, right? And Sinbad was like, well, of course, I've never made that movie. I think it was called Kazam, right?
Shazam. Yeah, Kazam is the real movie.
Yeah, that's right. So it's called Shazam, was the one that people remember, right? So, but Shazam was the actual movie with Shaq,
right,
in the 90s. So most people say, that was the real movie that we remember, right? And yet Kazam, right? And yet all these people remember Sinbad.
They ruined this because they made a joke on April Fool's Day that they made a fake movie where it looked like that was real. So people still are pulling that back up now and be like, look, the movie is real. So it kind of confused this Mandela effect.
It did. In fact, Sinbad shot a scene just for the hell of it, because he says people say that I was in this movie that I was never in, right? So he shot a scene and put it up on YouTube or something.
How weird.
Isn't that strange? Okay, but again, whether you believe this or not, what a simulation idea, right? This is how I got deep in the rabbit hole, is this idea that you can run something multiple times. And when you do, you may be remembering a previous run of the simulation. Where that brings us is right back to that complicated physics experiment that I was telling you about. an hour ago now or so, which was the delayed choice experiment, right? Remember I said there was a quasar sending light to us a billion light years, and a million light years away there was a black hole, and the decision about whether to go left or right should have been made in the past. It should have been made a million years ago. But the weirdness with quantum mechanics is telling us that decision is made now when we measure it. Until then, both possibilities actually exist. So most people can understand the multiverse idea as being something that starts here and spreads out, right? You're like, I go to college in Boston, I go to college in San Francisco. Those are like two different storylines. I marry this person, I marry this other person, right? So those are multiple possible futures. That's pretty easy to grasp the idea of, even if you don't believe the futures are out there, you just say if you make choices, you end up in different places. But the weird thing that is really hard to put your mind around is, what if there are multiple possible pasts, right? What if there was a past where the light went left? What if there was a past where the light went right a million years ago, right? What if there's a past where a meteor didn't kill the dinosaurs? There's a past where the meteor did kill the dinosaurs. What if there's a past where the guy in Tiananmen Square got run over by the tank? And what if there's a past where the guy didn't get run over by the tank? And it takes us right back to both the quantum physics idea that the past is not what we think it is, right? And there was a guy, Schrodinger, again, right, who actually made an obscure speech in the 1940s, I think, where he said, not only are we choosing which slit, the double slit experiment goes through now, let's say Schrodinger's cat is alive or dead, but we're choosing from one of several simultaneous histories when we make that observation.